Good afternoon and welcome to this live stream. Today we are on the 10th episode of our Learning Web Development in 2022 series. We're on the 10th episode, and in this episode we're going to be learning about how to interact with HTML using JavaScript. So let's dive right into that. So what you expect today we're going to learn about DOM, which is Document Object Model, and after that we'll learn about how to reference HTML elements in JavaScript, and we'll also learn how to manipulate HTML elements using JavaScript, and finally we'll learn how to read data from input fields using JavaScript. So yeah, for definition, we're defining DOM. DOM is basically like a tree. It connects all the HTML elements on your pages based on the hierarchy of how they are nested in your code. So JavaScript can actually walk down this DOM to identify specific elements. JavaScript can get access to a specific element using DOM, and after getting the access to that, it can actually change the element, like manipulate it or read data from it. So that's basically definition of DOM, but we'll go into writing some code so we can get a better understanding of the whole thing. So next thing we're switching to code editor, Visual Studio Code. So back in Visual Studio Code, we have our HTML5. We've created a blank HTML5 for this episode. So we have our HTML5, which is index.html. We're just going to scaffold the normal HTML5 structure, and after doing that now, we are going to get started. So the first thing we have at hand, the first thing we want to do is we want to see how we can reference an HTML element within our JavaScript code. So we're going to create a HTML element, a div, and we'll give the div an ID, and we'll call that ID. The value for the ID is going to be container. So this div is going to be empty, so we're going to reference it using JavaScript and eventually add contents to the div using JavaScript. So to write our JavaScript, we're going to go down just before the body, just keep things simple. We are going to create a script tag, and if you've been following along, you probably understand that script tag lets you write JavaScript within your HTML code. So now we have a script tag, and we're ready to start writing JavaScript. So the first JavaScript we are going to write is how to reference HTML elements from HTML. So this is the HTML we want to reference inside this JavaScript. So we're going to create a variable, but I choose to go for constant. So we're going to create a variable of type const. We'll call that variable container, and you set the value to a special function built into JavaScript for manipulating DOM. So that function is, you use a document dot, and you say get element by ID. So this is a method that it expects an argument, which is the ID of the element you want to get. So the ID of the element you want to get in this instance is container. That's the value from here. So that's what we want to get. So we'll put container there. So at this point, this variable container now holds reference to the HTML element. In order to prove that, we can save our document and switch back to the browser, and let's preview our document. I already have this document opened in one of my tab here. So yeah, if you reload this tab, you see you have a blank page because our div actually has no content. So we're done with referencing HTML within our JavaScript, and we are now ready to actually manipulate that HTML using JavaScript. So let's go back to our JavaScript code and get some data into the page using JavaScript and not just static HTML. So let's do that. We move back to VS Code, and we come down here after the variable we've created. We are going to say the variable container dot. We will be using, for this first example, we use inner HTML. So it's a property for HTML elements like div where you can modify their inner HTML. So we're going to use that property, and we'll say it's going to be equal to hello. We'll say it's equal to hello world. So by the time we save this code and we move back to our browser and we reload the page, let's go back to our browser. Let's reload the page. So you now see hello world printed inside. It's kind of interesting, though this is very basic, but if you look at your HTML code, initially we didn't have the hello world there. Instead, it's coming from JavaScript using the inner HTML property to do that. So we can see that that's how we got this hello world there. So let's do something more fun and dynamic. We are going to add multiple text into this container div, and we'll be doing that using, to even make things more interesting, we'll be doing that using an array and a for loop. So let's get rid of this code and let's create another variable, I will call it names. So this is going to be an array. So the array is going to hold some names. So we'll have names like John, Jane, Mary. Let's have Tom. So I have these 4 names in an array, and we are going to use a loop to actually manipulate our HTML such that those names are displayed on the screen. So we can come here and say for, we're using a for loop. Let's I equal 0, and the condition for our loop is going to be I is less than names dot length. So we went for this so that our code can be dynamic, instead of saying I is less than 4, because the names are 4, but this method dot length gives us like the length of the array. So the next thing is we'll do our increment operator saying I plus plus, standard stuff for doing a for loop. So now inside the loop, we're ready to like inject or manipulate our HTML by adding that data to it. So we can now make reference to container here and say container dot. So there's a special method called append. Unlike inner HTML, append lets you add one data, add another data after that. Like data is added at the end of the last data. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to say as the value, the arguments for append, we are going to say names. Sorry about that. So as the argument here, we're going to say names dot, sorry, it's an array, so we're going to say names, then square bracket and I, which is the index of our loop. So that solves that. So now let's save the page and see the output on our browser. Just save the page, switch back to the browser, and let's reload our page by hitting here. So you can see when I have James, John, James, Mary, and Tom all coming from that loop. So yeah, that's, if you add more names, it's going to end up here. So with this, we've been able to like use JavaScript to make our web page more dynamic. So we don't have to like hard code all the names in our HTML. These names could actually be coming from a RESTful API, which is something we're going to cover eventually in this series. And yeah, it could be coming from a database too, if you have a database that your website is connected to. So yeah, this like adds the first bit of dynamicness to our website. So the next thing we are going to be looking at is how to read values from input fields using JavaScript. So we have input fields like if you have a text field, how can you read that value from that text field using JavaScript? So let's quickly dive into that. In order to do that, go back to VS Code, and within VS Code we are going to add a form just below this container. Add a form. So inside our form, we are we're going to have a label that says first name, and after the label we have an input field of type text that says an input field of type text. It has an ID. Let's set the ID to fname. We need this ID for our JavaScript to be able to reference that, so we're going to add br to the end of that. So let's create another input field for last name. I'm just basically going to copy this code and modify it in order to save time. So yeah, I have this here. I'll just be changing this to last name and change the ID to L name. The next thing we need a button so the user can click. Need a button that the user can click. So that's going to trigger an alert. I think we'll go for the method of an alert. A button user can click to trigger an alert so that we could see what the user has typed in. And let's add that button using input type button, and let's give it a value that says submit. It's going to be text displayed to the user, so let's give it an ID. I'm going to give the ID submit btn, and yeah, so that's our submit button. So we're literally done with the user interface of our site. If we want, we can take a look at a preview before we switch to writing the JavaScript code. So let's go back to the main screen, and here we are back in our browser. Within our browser now, let's reload the page. We reload the page, and now we still have a form here that has for first name and last name. And clicking on this button does nothing at the moment, but when our JavaScript comes in, we are going to make that button show whatever name the user has typed in that input field. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and implement the JavaScript for this. So here we are back in Visual Studio Code, and yeah, I'm still going to leave this code intact. Now we need a way to trigger reading the data from the form field. If you see the first code we've written that reads the name and displays it, it loads at the moment this page loads. So yeah, that works for that case. But now we need to be able to like trigger this code only when the user has pressed the submit button. So in order to do that efficiently, the way to do that will be to use a function. So we're going to create a function. Create a function is a function keyword, then the name of the function. I'm going to call this function submit data, and this is the body of the function. So we're going to implement the code to actually submit the data within the body of the function. So first I'm going to create another variable, and I'll call it fname input. So this is going to make hold reference to the input field, to this first input field over here. So it's going to be equal to, just like we did with the div document.get elements by ID, and ID this time around is f name. Sorry, ID this time around is f name, and yeah. So now I need a way to read the data from the f name and display to the user. So we're going to be using the alert feature of the browser. So we use alert, and simply we are going to display f name input dot value. So there's a property like value, so we're going to use alert to display that. So now our function is ready, and we need a way to trigger the function. So this input field type button has a property like onClick, so we're going to tie this function to the onClick. So the function is submit data. So that's our function, and put the curly braces. So now we can save this and go back to our browser to see how much progress we've made. Let's see our code run. So here we are back in our browser, and let's refresh the page. Let's click this button, and you see we get a blank page because we've not typed anything. So let's type in John Doe and hitting submit. So see an alert that displays the name John Doe. So with that, we successfully been able to read data from the input field. So if we wish to try another example, we could actually read the second value, and let's get the first thing and the last thing and combine them together. So we can come down here and create another constant. Create another constant, and we'll call this constant L name input equal to document dot get elements by ID, and this time our ID will be L name. That's the ID from here. And yeah, so we could actually show a different alert to display that name, or we can even take things further and display the name in we could take things further and display the name inside the HTML element. But just to save time, so this string doesn't get too long, we could just display the name in an alert. But let's move this alert from here, and let's try doing some concatenation. So I'm pasting this alert here. I will say this is the value of the first name, and I'll use this plus operator to like concatenate that value space and plus. So this concatenation, you can Google that out to read about it in details later. So yeah, so I'm concatenating this code basically. So this is all the code I've written so far. So I've removed the alert, and we are reading value for f name separate, we're reading the value for l name separate, and sorry for not switching to the browser to the VS Code, but I'm going to explain now. So we are not displaying both names. This is a first name, then this is a space in between them. Using this plus sign, it's actually concatenation. That's what I meant by concatenation. It allows you to join like strings and constants and variables together. So yeah, we have this. So we can save our code and go back to the browser to see what we've done so far. So here we are back in our browser, and let's reload the page, and now we can type John in one and Doe in the next in the second one. So let's do that. So let's type John in the first name field and Doe in the second name field, and we'll click submit. So you see an alert that says John Doe. You can still try Jane. Let's try Jane Phil, for example, and you see he gets those two values being concatenated. So yeah, with that, to keep the stream short, we have come to the end of today's episode explaining DOM, like how you can make reference to HTML elements using your JavaScript code, and how you can manipulate those elements, or you could read data from input fields using JavaScript. Yeah. So thank you for joining us. And in the next episode, it's probably going to be much longer. We'll dive deeper into now working with the basics of JavaScript we've learned, adding it to manipulating DOM, and we'll see how we can do something like form validation. And also I think we'll do form validation first, that we introduce ourselves, so like HTTP requests, like how to read data from an external service using JavaScript and add dynamic data to your website using that method. Yeah, so thank you for tuning in today, and